The plastic tip of the marker clicked sharply against the whiteboard. Once, twice, 3 times. Mr. Miller stood with his back to the room, the marker poised over the clean white surface. He did not turn around until the scratching sound stopped and the room had settled into total silence. Sam, Leo, and Omar sat in the front row, their eyes fixed on the board. Mr. Miller turned, his gaze sweeping across the 3 students. He tapped the board again, right over the center, where the ink was still drying. Today, we master the maps of our lives. We start with where we come from. Nationalities. He paused, letting the weight of the task settle. The students shifted in their chairs, a quiet, expectant energy filling the space between the desks. Mr. Miller uncapped the marker and moved his hand toward the board. He wrote a single question in large, bold letters. "Where are you from?" He stepped back, the marker held like a pointer. The classroom felt smaller now, focused entirely on the board and the names that would soon fill the space beneath that question. The lesson had officially begun. Mr. Miller lowered the marker and looked directly at Sam. He gestured with his open palm toward the desk in the front row. Sam pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping against the floor, and stood up straight. He looked at the question on the board, took a breath, and spoke clearly. "I am from Egypt. I am Egyptian." The room seemed to hold the weight of his words for a second. Mr. Miller nodded once, a sharp, approving movement, and reached for the board. He wrote Egypt and Egyptian in neat, block letters under the initial question. He did not stop there. He turned his attention to Leo, who had been watching the board with intense focus. "Now, Leo, tell us about yourself, mister," Miller said. Leo cleared his throat, the sound small in the quiet room. He stood up, mirroring Sam's posture. "My name is Leo. I am from Italy. I am Italian." As he spoke, the classroom atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a lesson, it was a map being drawn in real time. Mr. Miller moved the marker again, adding the new name and nationality to the list, the ink darkening the white surface as the diversity of the room became visible to everyone. Mr. Miller did not waste a moment. He turned toward the 3rd desk where Omar sat, hands folded neatly on the wooden surface. The marker cap clicked as he recapped it, then clicked again as he pulled it off. He gestured to the final open space on the whiteboard. "Your turn, Omar," he prompted, his voice steady. Omar rose from his seat. He stood with his back straight, his eyes tracking the rows of names already written above. He spoke with clear, measured intent. "I am Omar. I am from Iraq. I am Iraqi." "Mr." Miller stepped forward and added the final entry, his hand moving with a practiced, fluid motion. He circled the 3 nationalities with a single, swift stroke of the marker. Then, he clapped his hands once, a sharp, resonant sound that cut through the lingering echoes of the introductions. The classroom felt different now. The board was no longer a blank space, but a record of their shared presence. Sam, Leo, and Omar exchanged glances, a newfound confidence evident in the way they sat. They were no longer just observers of the lesson. Their identities were marked, visible, and established. Mr. Miller capped the marker and leaned against the desk, surveying the room with a satisfied nod. The first phase of the task was complete. Mr. Miller tapped the board twice, the sound echoing against the quiet desks. He erased a small smudge near the bottom and turned to face the 3 students. "Now we move to family," he announced. "Who can name their relatives in English?" He looked across the room, waiting. Sam shifted, his hand going up before the teacher had even finished the sentence. Mr. Miller pointed to him. Sam leaned forward, his expression intent. "I have a brother and a sister," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Mr. Miller turned back to the whiteboard immediately, his hand moving with purpose as he wrote brother and sister in large, clear letters beneath the nationalities. The classroom dynamic changed. The lesson was no longer just about geography. It was about the people waiting for them at home. Mr. Miller stepped back, looking at the words he had just written. He made a small check mark next to each one. "Excellent," he said, his tone shifting to something more collaborative. He walked slowly toward the front row, his gaze moving between Sam, Leo, and Omar. The students sat taller now, the connection between the English vocabulary and their own lives becoming tangible. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as they prepared to define the people who mattered most to them. Mr. Miller did not pause to let the momentum fade. He returned to the whiteboard, his eyes scanning the list he had just created. In English, we use specific titles for every connection, he said, his voice dropping into a teaching rhythm. He turned back to the students. What about your father's brother? Leo leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he processed the question. He took a breath and spoke clearly. That is an uncle. Mr. Miller nodded once and immediately wrote uncle on the board, the marker squeaking against the surface. He did not stop there. He tapped the board again, moving his focus to the next challenge. And what of your mother's sister? Omar looked up, his posture alert. That is an aunt, he replied. Mr. Miller moved his hand in a swift, continuous motion, circling both words until the ink darkened the space. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the students to ensure they followed the logic. The board was becoming a map of relationships, each term carefully placed. He leaned against the front desk, watching as the three students studied the new additions. The challenge was rising, and the room grew quiet with the weight of the new vocabulary. Mr. Miller stood straight, his marker hovering near the board. He cleared his throat to reclaim the room's focus. Now, we practice the full structure, he said, his voice firm and deliberate. He wrote a long string of words beneath the family titles, his movements precise and rhythmic. Repeat after me. This is my uncle. He is from England. He is English. He waited, his eyes locked on the students. Sam, Leo, and Omar leaned in, their breathing shallow as they prepared for the drill. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Mr. Miller gestured with his hand, pulling the words from them. They repeated the sentence in unison, but the rhythm faltered halfway through. Mr. Miller held up a hand, stopping them instantly. Again, he commanded, his posture rigid. Focus on the connection between the location and the nationality. He tapped the board with the marker tip for emphasis. They tried again, voices rising together, working to align their pace with his cadence. This time, the flow held. They finished the final word in perfect synchronization. Mr. Miller gave a short, sharp nod, his expression revealing the weight of the task. They had successfully navigated the structure, but the intensity in the room remained high as they waited for the next requirement. Mr. Miller did not wait for the air to settle. He erased a section of the board and tapped it twice with his marker, signaling the start of the final push. Rotate, he ordered, his gaze snapping from student to student. Leo, start. Leo sat up, his fingers drumming against the desk as he searched for the words. My aunt is Spanish, he said, his voice clipped and hurried. Before he could even finish, Omar jumped in, his eyes darting to the board for the next prompt. My brother is Iraqi, Omar added, snapping his head toward Sam. The room began to buzz with the sound of their combined voices, a rapid-fire sequence of titles and countries that collided in the air. Sam leaned forward, his chair legs scraping against the floor as he picked up the pace. My cousin is American, Sam announced, his face tight with concentration. They were no longer speaking in a slow, careful cadence. They were racing against the clock. Mr. Miller paced the front of the room, his marker held like a baton, chopping the air to keep their tempo high. They stumbled, corrected, and pushed forward. The cycle of family roles and nationalities spinning faster with every passing second. The rapid-fire chatter died the moment Mr. Miller stepped away from the whiteboard. He moved into the aisles, his footsteps muffled by the carpet but heavy with expectation. The room held its breath. He stopped beside Leo, who froze, his hand tightening around his pencil. Mr. Miller leaned in, his gaze fixed on Leo's lips. Again, he commanded, his voice barely a whisper. Pronounce the nationality clearly. Leo swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet. He spoke the sentence, his voice cracking slightly before he corrected the final syllable. Mr. Miller didn't blink. He simply nodded and drifted to Omar's desk. Omar shifted, his shoulders hunching as he felt the teacher's shadow loom over him. The marker and Mr. Miller's hand tapped the desk surface, a steady, rhythmic ticking that measured the seconds of Omar's hesitation. Now, Mr. Miller prompted. Omar delivered the line, his words sharp and clipped, straining for perfect articulation. When he finished, he didn't exhale. He waited for the verdict. Mr. Miller moved to Sam, the final barrier. The air felt thin, charged with the focus of the entire room. Every student sat rigid watching the interaction, knowing their own turn was only a heartbeat away as the teacher demanded absolute linguistic precision. Mr. Miller stood at the front of the row, his presence filling the space between the desks. He looked at Sam, then tapped the board with his marker, the sound echoing against the quiet walls. Sam felt the weight of the room shifting toward him. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and rose to his feet. He met the teacher's gaze, steadying his breathing. The pressure that had hung over the room for the last hour seemed to condense into this single moment. Sam cleared his throat, his posture rigid. He did not look at his notes or the board. He looked straight ahead. "This is my uncle," Sam said, his voice clear and resonant. He took a short breath, maintained his focus, and finished the task. "He is French." The words hung in the air, perfectly articulated. Mr. Miller stood still for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the student's face for any sign of doubt. Then, he tapped the board one last time, a sharp, decisive sound that broke the tension completely. The air in the room seemed to lighten, the sharp edges of the lesson softening into a shared sense of completion. Sam stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, as the final objective of the day was met. Mr. Miller raised a hand, his thumb extended in a firm, approving gesture. He turned back to the whiteboard and capped his marker with a sharp click that signaled the end of the day. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with scrutiny, but light with relief. He turned to face the room. "Well done," he said, his voice echoing in the now open space. Class dismissed. The chairs scraped against the floor as the students pushed them in, a sound of rhythmic clatter that replaced the earlier tension. Sam exhaled, the rigidity in his shoulders finally giving way. He gathered his notebooks into a neat stack, his movements fluid and unhurried. Leo and Omar exchanged a brief, knowing nod, the fatigue of the hour replaced by a visible, quiet pride. They walked toward the door, their steps steady and purposeful. As they crossed the threshold, the cool air of the hallway hit them, a final contrast to the focused heat of the classroom. They did not look back. They walked out of the room, leaving the whiteboard behind, carrying the certainty of their progress with them. The door swung shut, clicking softly into place, leaving the classroom empty and silent, the work of the day complete.